Story 1. Parking garage normal routine and setting. I was 26 at the time, working as a junior analyst for a marketing firm in downtown Charlotte. Our office was on the 12th floor of a glass building that stayed lit long after most of the surrounding offices went dark. My hours were technically 9 to 6, but deadlines didn't respect that schedule. Most nights, I packed up around 9:30 p.m., sometimes closer to 10. It became so consistent that my body almost expected it. For 2 years, I parked in the same multi-level garage across the street. Required badge access after 8, and there were security cameras mounted at every corner. Patrol cart made rounds every hour or so. I always parked on level 3, near the pedestrian bridge that connected directly to my building. It shaved a few minutes off my walk, and after enough repetition, it just felt like my spot. The routine was simple. Shut down my computer, ride the elevator down alone, swipe my badge, walk between the concrete pillars toward my car. The garage had its usual nighttime sounds. Engines starting, tires rolling over painted lines, distant footsteps echoing. Nothing about it felt threatening. If anything, it felt controlled and familiar. I never rushed. I never scanned the shadows. After hundreds of uneventful nights, the garage became background noise in my life, predictable, well-lit, and safe enough that I stopped questioning it. First red flags. The first time I noticed the car, it barely registered. It was a dark sedan parked 2 rows over from my usual spot on level 3. The engine was running, which I only realized because of the low vibration in the air and the faint exhaust drifting behind it. I assumed someone was finishing a phone call before heading home. Downtown garages weren't exactly quiet places, and people sat in their cars all the time. The second night, it was there again. Same level, same general area. Engine idling. I slowed my steps without meaning to. The windows were tinted enough that I couldn't see inside. The car was angled slightly toward the exit ramp, as if ready to leave. I told myself it was probably another late worker with a routine similar to mine. Plenty of offices in the building stayed open late. On the third night, the timing changed. I pushed open the door from the pedestrian bridge and stepped into the garage. Almost immediately, headlights flared on from across the level. The sudden wash of light stretched across the concrete floor and briefly caught the edges of the pillars. It wasn't dramatic, just abrupt, like the driver had been waiting for something. I paused for half a second, then kept walking. My footsteps sounded louder than usual. I tried to line up the sequence logically in my head. Maybe they had just started the car remotely. Maybe I hadn't noticed the lights turning on before. Still, when I reached my car, I unlocked it faster than normal and got inside without looking directly at the sedan. As I pulled out of my space, I could feel its headlights following the movement of my car, though it didn't move. On the drive home, I replayed it and minimized everything. Public garage, common behavior, no evidence of anything intentional. But the next evening, as I rode the elevator down, I caught myself wondering whether the car would be there again.
Pattern recognition. The next day, I made 2 small changes. When I arrived at work that morning, I parked on level 5 instead of 3. I chose a space near the far corner, nowhere near the pedestrian bridge. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't mention it out loud. It felt almost childish, like I was testing a theory I didn't want to admit I had. That evening, I stayed later than usual. Instead of leaving at 9:30, I waited until 10:20. I told my coworker I had extra revisions to finish. In reality, I just wanted to see if anything would shift. When I stepped off the elevator onto level 5, the first thing I heard was the low hum of an engine. About 4 rows over, angled toward the ramp, sat the same dark sedan. It took me a second to confirm it. The lighting on 5 was slightly dimmer, and for a moment I tried to convince myself it was a different car. But as I walked closer to my own vehicle, I noticed the same small dent near the rear bumper, same tinted windows, same stillness. The driver hadn't just randomly ended up on my new level. They were positioned within clear sight of my parking spot. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to keep walking normally. I unlocked my car, slid inside, and locked the doors immediately. As I adjusted my mirrors, I saw the sedan's brake lights glow briefly, like someone had shifted their foot. Not pulling out, just reacting. There's no reasonable explanation now. I hadn't parked on 5 in over a year. I had left almost an hour later than usual. Yet the car was here, idling in proximity again. For the first time, I allowed myself to think it clearly. This wasn't coincidence. Someone was tracking my pattern and adjusting to it. Escalation, road mirroring. I didn't look directly at the sedan as I pulled out of my space, but I watched it through the rearview mirror. It waited until I reached the end of the row before it started moving. Not fast, not aggressively. Just enough to fall in behind me. We exited the garage one after the other. I told myself I was still guessing. Downtown had limited routes out of that area, and plenty of drivers used the same turns. But when I made a right instead of my usual left onto Tryon Street, the sedan followed. I drove 2 blocks and turned again, choosing a side street I never used. The car stayed behind me, maintaining a steady distance. My grip tightened on the steering wheel. At the next intersection, I slowed earlier than necessary, signaling late to see if it would hesitate. It didn't. It mirrored the movement exactly, brake lights glowing in sync with mine. That was when the fear shifted from suspicion to certainty. Instead of heading toward the highway entrance like I normally would, I steered toward a brightly lit gas station 3 blocks ahead. It was still open, fluorescent lights flooding the lot. As I pulled in sharply, the sedan slowed at the entrance. For a moment, I thought it would follow me inside. It didn't. It rolled past the driveway, paused briefly at the next corner, then continued straight down the street and disappeared from view. I sat there with the engine running, heart racing, staring at the empty road it had just taken.
Major climax blocked exit the next night. I debated not going into work at all. Instead, I convinced myself that one more observation would give me clarity. I parked on level 3 again, deliberately returning to my original routine. I left at 9:28 p.m., almost exactly on schedule. When I stepped into the garage, the sedan was already there. This time it wasn't 2 rows away. It was parked directly beside my driver's side door, close enough that I would have to squeeze between the 2 vehicles to get in. The engine was running, headlights off. Windows tinted black under the fluorescent lights. I slowed, pretending to check my phone. My pulse was loud in my ears. I considered turning around and heading back to the elevator, but I didn't want to signal panic. As I stepped closer, I heard it, a soft metallic click. My door handle moved, not fully. Just enough to confirm someone inside had reached across and pulled it. I froze. Before I could react, a small white security cart rounded the corner of the level, headlights sweeping across both cars. The patrol guard slowed when he saw me standing there. The sedan's brake lights flared immediately. The engine revved slightly, and within seconds, it reversed out of the space and sped toward the exit ramp. I stood there, shaking, staring at the empty spot beside my car where it had just been. Aftermath and reflection, I reported the plate number 2 security that night and filed a police report the next morning. A week later, the garage manager called to confirm what I already suspected. The sedan had been entering between 8:45 and 9 p.m. almost every evening for nearly 2 weeks, parking on whichever level I used and leaving shortly after I did. I transferred to a different garage and shifted my work hours whenever possible. I stopped treating routine like protection. Predictability, I realized, isn't harmless when someone else is studying it. Story TWO Public Transit Daily Commute Establishment. I was 22 and in my last year of university when this happened. I worked part-time at a bookstore near campus, which meant I usually caught the 8:15 p.m. train home. It wasn't a long ride, about 20 minutes, but it became such a fixed part of my routine that I stopped paying attention to it. I'd close up the store, say goodnight to my manager, and walk the 3 blocks to the station with my headphones in and my phone already out to check the arrival board, even though I knew the schedule by heart. The platform at that hour was almost always crowded. Commuters heading home, students lingering in groups, people leaning against pillars scrolling through their phones. The overhead lights were harsh and bright, and there were security cameras mounted along the ceiling. Transit officers passed through often enough that their presence felt routine rather than reassuring. Stood in roughly the same spot every night, near the 3rd carriage marker. It lined up with the exit at my stop, saving a few minutes on the walk home. After months of repeating the same movements, same train, same door, same staircase, it stopped feeling like public space and started feeling like an extension of my day. Predictable, busy, well-lit, safe, at least in theory. Or maybe I did and dismissed him immediately. The platform was always full of familiar strangers' faces you saw often enough to recognize but never speak to. It was the third or fourth evening when I became aware of him in a way that stuck. I was standing near the third carriage marker like usual, phone in my hand, music low in one ear. A few feet behind me stood a man I didn't recognize from classes or the bookstore. Mid-30s, maybe. Dark jacket zipped up despite the mild weather. Backpack slung over one shoulder. Wasn't staring directly at me, but he wasn't looking at anything in particular either. When the train arrived, I stepped forward with the crowd. I didn't check if he boarded the same carriage. I assumed he did because most people around me did. The next evening, I saw him again. Same general position behind me, same jacket. Same distance far enough not to feel intrusive, close enough that I noticed when he shifted his weight. There was no interaction, no accidental bumping, no eye contact. By the fifth night, the repetition felt deliberate. I arrived slightly later than usual, closer to 8:20. The platform was thinner that evening. As I walked toward my usual waiting spot, I saw him already there, standing near the third marker. When I stopped, he adjusted subtly, stepping just enough to remain a few feet behind me. Still no words. Still no direct contact. Just proximity. I told myself it meant nothing. Public transit creates overlap. But that night, for the first time, I boarded the train aware of exactly where he was behind me.
Behavioral mirroring, I started paying attention after that. The first thing I noticed was the carriage. My train usually had 8, and some were noticeably less crowded than others. One night, the front half was nearly empty while the middle was packed. I deliberately walked toward the emptier front section, breaking my usual habit. He followed, not immediately, not obviously. But as I stepped inside and grabbed a pole near the door, he boarded through the same entrance seconds later. There were other spaces available. He chose the one closest to me. I tested it again the following evening. This time I lingered near the back of the platform until the last moment, then slipped into a rear carriage just before the doors closed. He made it in just behind me. It wasn't subtle anymore. What unsettled me more was the exit pattern. For months I had never seen him leave at my stop. I would have remembered. It wasn't a major station, mostly residential traffic. But now, 2 nights in a row, he stepped off when I did. The first time, I told myself it was coincidence. The second time, I changed my route intentionally. Instead of taking the usual staircase up to the main street, I veered toward the secondary stairwell at the far end of the platform. Hardly anyone used it because it led to a longer walk home. I climbed halfway before glancing back. He was there. Same distance, same measured pace, not rushing, not hesitating. At street level, I slowed, pretending to check my phone. He slowed too. There was no direct confrontation, no attempt to speak. But by then, the pattern had hardened into something undeniable. He wasn't just present, he was adjusting. Isolation, escalation. It was raining the night everything shifted. Not heavy rain, just steady enough to thin the crowd. Most people rushed down the stairs with umbrellas already open. When I reached the platform at 8:14, it felt wider than usual. The sound of the rain hitting the tracks filled the gaps where conversation normally would have been. He was already there. This time, he wasn't several feet behind me. He stood slightly to my left, maybe 2 steps away. Close enough that I could see the outline of his reflection in the glass barrier along the platform. His hood was up, jacket damp at the shoulders. He wasn't pretending to scroll through his phone, he was just standing. I shifted down the platform casually, increasing the distance between us. He adjusted a moment later, not abruptly. Not enough to draw attention, just enough to remain within that same proximity. I checked my phone, 8% battery. The number felt heavier than it should have. I opened the front camera and held the phone up at an angle, pretending I was on FaceTime. I even nodded occasionally, like I was listening to someone. I kept my voice low, murmuring responses that weren't real. He didn't react. He didn't look at the screen or move away. When the announcement crackled overhead saying the train was delayed 12 minutes, the platform grew even quieter. And in that stretched silence, I realized he had stepped closer again, close enough that I could hear him exhale when the wind shifted. Major climax, platform cornering. When the announcement repeated the delay 12 minutes, I Felt the time stretch in a way it never had before. The platform was nearly empty now. A couple stood at the far end under the overhang. One person sat on a bench scrolling through their phone. Everyone else had either left or moved farther down to stay out of the rain. He stepped closer. Not behind me this time. In front. "Do you live around here?" he asked. His voice was calm, almost conversational, like we'd been standing next to each other by accident. I lowered my phone slightly, but didn't drop the act. "I'm on a call," I said quietly. He didn't back up. He took another step forward, closing the space I'd just created. "I've seen you here a lot," he added. "Just wondering." The words weren't aggressive. That made it worse. I shifted sideways, putting more distance between us. He shifted too. Not touching, not blocking. Just close enough that I would have had to brush past him to leave in the opposite direction. At the far end of the platform, I noticed a transit security officer walking slowly along the edge, checking something on a handheld device. I didn't say anything else. I turned and walked directly toward the officer. I didn't run. I didn't look back. I just moved with purpose, holding my phone up like I was still on a call. Halfway down the platform, I glanced over my shoulder. He was no longer behind me. By the time I reached the officer and turned again, the man had disappeared into the stairwell. Aftermath. I reported him the next morning through the transit authority's non-emergency line. I gave a description: height, jacket, backpack, approximate age, and explained the pattern. How he adjusted when I changed carriages. How he exited when I did. How he approached me during the delay. The woman on the phone listened carefully and asked which train and which stairwell. She didn't sound surprised. A few days later, I received a follow-up call. She told me there had been similar reports over the past month. No physical assaults, but repeated following behavior and unwanted attempts at conversation at the same time slot. Hearing that made it feel more real, not dramatic, just intentional. I switched to the 7:40 train after that and started varying where I stood. The commute became less convenient, but I stopped assuming routine was harmless. Established comfort zone. I was 28 when this happened, living alone in a quiet suburban neighborhood just outside the city. It wasn't gated or heavily patrolled, but it had that kind of unspoken safety people associate with trimmed lawns and school zones. Neighbors waved when they saw each other. Porch lights stayed on overnight. Nothing about it ever felt unpredictable. Every morning at 6 a.m., my alarm went off. By 6:15, I was outside tying my shoes on the front step before starting the same 3-mile loop I'd been running for almost 2 years. Down Maple Ridge Drive, left past the small park, through the row of townhouses, then back around the elementary school before heading home. The whole thing took about 28 minutes if I kept a steady pace. At that hour, the streets were mostly empty. A few dog walkers, the occasional car heading toward the highway, sprinklers ticking on at the same houses at the same time. I never wore headphones. I liked being aware of my surroundings, even though there had never been a reason to feel cautious. The repetition was comforting. I knew which sidewalks were uneven, which streetlights flickered, which houses left their garage doors cracked open overnight. Running felt like the safest part of my gay open space, clear visibility, familiar routes. For years, nothing interrupted that rhythm. And because nothing ever had, I stopped considering that someone else might notice it too. First glimpse? The first time I saw the SUV, it barely registered. It was parked along the curb near the corner house at the start of Maple Ridge Drive, dark gray or black, hard to tell in the early morning light. The windows were heavily tinted, and the engine was off. No lights, no movement inside. I assumed it belonged to a guest or someone staying overnight. The next morning, it was in the same spot. I noticed it because the rest of the street hadn't changed. Same blue pickup across the way. Same recycling bins by the curb. The SUV looked out of place, but not enough to alarm me. Plenty of people had similar vehicles. It wasn't damaged or parked illegally, just there. On the third morning, it was still there. That was when it started to feel deliberate. 3 consecutive days, same position, same orientation toward the street. The windshield reflected the pale sky, making it impossible to see inside. As I ran past, I slowed slightly without meaning to, scanning for any sign of movement. Nothing. No driver. No glow from a dashboard. No condensation on the windows. I told myself it was probably someone visiting the corner house long term. Maybe a relative, maybe a college kid home for the week. But as I continued my run, I found myself glancing back over my shoulder at the vehicle longer than necessary. It wasn't doing anything, and yet the fact that it wasn't doing anything at all made it harder to ignore.
Pattern confirmation on the fourth morning, the SUV wasn't at the corner house. For a second, I felt almost relieved. I passed the spot expecting to see that same dark shape, but the curb was empty. I told myself that was the end of it. Maybe whoever owned it had finally left. I ran past the park and into the townhouse stretch without thinking much more about it. The streets were quiet like always, pale light spreading slowly across the rooftops. I was halfway through my loop, nearing the elementary school, when I saw it again, parked across from the fenced playground, engine off, windows tinted. Same dull, dark paint that absorbed the morning light instead of reflecting it. I slowed instinctively. That part of my route was nearly a mile from the corner house. To get there, the driver would have had to leave the original spot before I reached it and reposition without passing me. I replayed the timing in my head. I hadn't heard an engine, hadn't seen a car drive by. The next morning it appeared again, this time along Maple Ridge, near the final stretch of my loop where I usually crossed the street to head home. It wasn't in the original corner spot or by the school. It was positioned exactly where I would pass with about 5 minutes left in my run. That's when the math stopped making sense. There was no reasonable way for the SUV to be at different points along my loop on different days without moving between them. And if it was moving, that meant the driver knew approximately how long it took me to reach each section, which meant they were tracking more than just where I ran. They were tracking when. Escalation, direct following. By the fifth morning, I stopped assuming it was coincidence. The corner was clear when I started my run. No SUV, no sign of it along the first stretch past the park. For a few minutes, I almost convinced myself I had imagined the pattern entirely. Then, as I turned onto Maple Ridge for the return stretch, I heard an engine behind me, not accelerating, not revving, just idling low and steady. I shifted slightly toward the sidewalk, expecting the vehicle to pass. It didn't. The sound stayed directly behind me, maintaining a slow, deliberate crawl. I could feel it before I looked. When I glanced over my shoulder, the dark SUV was there, rolling forward at maybe 5 miles per hour, keeping half a block of distance between us. No honk, no attempt to pass, just pacing me. My pulse spiked. I kept running, pretending nothing had changed, but my stride shortened without meaning to. After about 30 seconds, I made an abrupt decision. I cut right onto a narrow side street I had never used before, short residential lane that curved out of sight. The moment I turned, the engine noise paused, slowed near the corner and glanced back. The SUV had stopped at the intersection, sitting still for several seconds, as if deciding. Then it continued straight past without following. It didn't turn, just drove on.
Major climax, dead-end street the next morning. I decided I needed proof. Instead of following my usual loop, I cut right 2 blocks early and headed toward a small cul-de-sac behind the elementary school. It was a dead-end street with 5 houses and no through traffic. I had never run through it before. If the SUV showed up there, it wouldn't be accidental. I kept my pace steady, trying to look normal. The street was quiet, sprinklers ticking against trimmed lawns. As I reached the rounded end of the cul-de-sac, I slowed to a jog and pretended to stretch, facing back toward the entrance. That's when I heard it, the low hum of an engine turning the corner. The dark SUV rolled into the cul-de-sac behind me. It didn't hesitate. It didn't circle like a lost driver. It pulled forward and angled slightly across the narrow exit, blocking the only way out. Close enough that I could see my reflection faintly in the windshield. For a second, everything felt still. Then the driver's side door opened a few inches. I didn't wait. I sprinted across the nearest lawn, cutting between 2 houses toward the next street over. Gravel crunched under my shoes. I heard the car door shut behind me but didn't look back. By the time I reached the main road, the SUV was already gone. Immediate aftermath, I called the police as soon as I got inside and locked the door. My voice shook more than I expected while I described the SUV, the cul-de-sac, and the partial license plate I had forced myself to memorize before running. An officer came by within an hour to take a formal statement. Over the next week, patrol cars drove slowly through the neighborhood around 6 a.m. They never located the vehicle, and I never saw it parked along my route again. Quiet closing reflection, I don't run the same loop anymore. Some mornings I go earlier, sometimes later, and I change directions without planning it. Routine once felt harmless, even comforting. Now I understand how predictability can be studied and used. Nothing else happened, but I stopped assuming familiarity meant safety.